Hello, today I'll be doing my presentation on the book Violence, Six Sideways Reflections by Slavoj Zizek. And if you don't know who Zizek is, he's a philosopher in the Marxist and Lacanian traditions of thought. He's a cultural critic, he's a psychoanalyst, and he's an agent provocateur, according to the summary of this book. And this book came out in 2008. In Violence, the 6 chapters that Zizek presents as his sideways reflections are so called because of their culturally analytical nature. Zizek says that we must avoid the predominant lure of our sensationalist media to focus on directly visible, subjective violence, or violence performed by a clearly visible agent. So what does this leave Zizek to investigate then? Though Zizek labels his reflections as sideways, his reflections on implicit ideological biases and actions which form the background on which violence will permeate, then burst, seems to me more like a cultural X-ray vision. For a thorough ideological inquiry, it is important to keep in mind that Zizek will not exclude liberalism, including the ideals of tolerance and language as a medium of peacemaking, from scrutiny. As this book has a lot of intersecting arguments that compel us to consider violence in many global, personal, and national instances without a particular focus or takeaway, I'd like to represent some of his arguments that will seem controversial until the dialectical reasoning is played out. What if it's the earnestly liberal societies of the West that unintentionally support the religious intolerance and statist violence of states such as Israel? Though this specific book was written in 2008, the topic of Israel and Palestine clash has been a central issue to Zizek's discourse even up until recently, when I reviewed a recent speech of his for the Oxford Union in 2024. I believe Zizek singles out Israel for its combination of Western democratic ideals and intolerance towards the other that Western media often attributes to terrorists from Middle Eastern countries. But he does this to show how solutionable these problems of ideological violence could be if we have the courage to question the shared background or heritage of violence. So, beginning with the framework of the 3 forms of violence, Zizek states, this is the starting point, perhaps even the axiom of the present book. Subjective violence is just the most visible portion of a triumvirate that also includes 2 objective kinds of violence. First, there is the symbolic violence embodied in language and its forms. Though at this point the reader might believe himself to be on the same page with Zizek if they come up with examples of offensive language that can incite people to act violently, Zizek follows up with an important clarification. Symbolic violence is not just about the concrete content or even the implicit significance of the communication itself, but it is also the fundamental, perhaps even metaphysical dimension of language as such. We will return to the latent potential for violence in the symbolic later to qualify Zizek's views with Lacanian theory. Second in the triad comes systemic violence, or the often catastrophic consequences of the smooth functioning of our economic and political systems. As a neo-Marxist theorist, it is important in reading Zizek to recognize the link between the capitalist system and our material or objective conditions that is a given in his conception of ideological background forces. Zizek writes, objective violence is invisible since it sustains the very zero-level standard against which we perceive something as subjectively violent. Our sensationalist media often neglects this ground level of ideology, instead presenting the last form of violence, subjective violence in the form of crime and terrorism, as an irrational anomaly in our otherwise cooperative culture. But Zizek would argue that a particular crisis only explodes into media visibility as the result of a complex struggle, and has less to do with our humanitarian concerns as it has to do with the implicit structure of objectivity that was outlined above. To clarify with an example of systemic violence in our neoliberal capitalist society, Zizek begins with the example of what he calls liberal communists, or capitalists that apparently have a concrete humanitarian concern or concerns that they philanthropically aid using their own money and time. Zizek writes, their claim is that we can have the globalist capitalist cake, i.e., thrive as profitable entrepreneurs, and eat it too, i.e., endorse the anti-capitalist causes of social responsibility and ecological concern. What is objectively decisive for Zizek, though, is that humanitarian causes obscure what is truly socioeconomic inequality. Zizek claims that for the liberal communist, there is no single exploited working class today. There are only concrete problems to be solved. This reminds me of the common proverb, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach him how to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. But the liberal communist does not want the man to learn to fish and to support himself, because the logic of humanitarianism for the rich actually secures their exploitation of the classes and resources that they use to build such wealth in the first place. In a final ideological stroke, Zizek reveals the outcome of such philanthropy. In liberal communist ethics, the ruthless pursuit of profit is counteracted by charity, the humanitarian mask hiding the face of economic exploitation, its superego blackmail of gigantic proportions. He relates this idea to Bataille's theory of necessary fiscal expenditure that supports the general economy. The liberal communists cannot expand on the industry and hoard their wealth indefinitely. Rather, the apparent self-negation of charity, or self-effacement, as Zizek argues, is the logical concluding point of capitalist circulation, since it allows the capitalist system to postpone its crises. The invisibility of systemic violence under the capitalist system is why ordinary people will admire the liberal communist who gave the people a fish, so to speak, when he had the ability to teach them to fish. Failures of the system to properly educate people and provide them with adequate professions and careers is also seen as a personal failure, because the individualism of our society has become an inalterable fact for most people. Zizek writes, Friedrich Hayek knew it was much easier to accept inequalities if one claims that they result from an impersonal blind force. The good thing about the irrationality of the market and the success or failure in capitalism is that it allows me to perceive my failure or success as undeserved or contingent, like an imponderable fate, thereby making it acceptable to the majority. Okay, so to move on to the section, Fear Thy Neighbor as Thyself, we must return to the problem of violence and subjective expression, but how are we to understand actions such as terrorism in a time when liberalism has seemingly opened a space for tolerance of most viewpoints? After all, liberalism was the result of the 30 Years' War in Europe from 1618 to 1648, when the catastrophe of the clash of religious and cultural differences revealed the necessity of putting aside our differences to participate in democracy. According to Zizek, the fact that certain attitudes, norms, and habits of our daily life appear to be neutral, non-ideological, natural, or commonsensical is actually ideology at its purest and most effective. Well, we tend to designate ideology as that which stands out from this background, such as extreme religious zeal. This problem is only half enunciated when we look at the systemic violence of our system. But as Zizek has illustrated, universality that is colored by our particular views and thus implies secret exclusions can in part perpetuate the power of white male property owners to exchange freely on the market in the name of human rights. And this is how a lot of Marxists, he says, tend to think about the problem of systemic violence. But there is a factor that remains, and what remains in a realm apart from systemic violence is the effectiveness of the symbol, as égale liberté or universality is an efficient symbolic fiction for the very fact that it must be enunciated from its eccentric conception in every particular life world. Language becomes its own symbolic violence because it inherently conceals the infinite abyss of the other, as what resists universality is the properly inhuman dimension of the neighbor. The neutral universal of tolerance is only so pacifying in Western culture because we are already accustomed to a certain distance from our neighbor. This is exemplified for Zizek in our fear of harassment, which encroaches on one's fearful respect for the abyss of the other. Symbolic violence represents a condensation of subjects that would be formidable if not mortified by their being named in concrete language, which imposes a determined symbolic field for all. Though we like to believe that symbolic language serves as a tool of mediation because parties are in communication as opposed to direct or violent confrontation. But for the anti-Western liberal But for the anti-Western terrorist, the West presents its own ethos in the condensed form of a logos of so-called universality, which the terrorist is apt to make a futile attempt to attack with subjective violence. To put it more directly, what we assume to be an implicit agreement between parties to participate given their position in a dialogue is considered unacceptable for the very terms under which we negotiate for certain people. But such violent, subjective outbursts on the part of the terrorist will imply acceptance of the Western ethos of universality, for the very fact that he is expressing his belief in violent outbursts. He is showing an internalization of universality. The symbolic efficiency of universality is at odds with faith, because faith would not need such a vehement expression if it were so undeniably true in the heart of the fundamentalist believer before God. Zizek asks of the fundamentalist, "If you are right before God, why must you make your belief a visible struggle to defend it from the Western world?" The Western liberal, for his part, is urged to maintain a distance from this other, to practice blindness to oppression on behalf of respect for the other, except for when media reports of subjective violence are used to horrify and shock the viewer, as is the case with the terrorism. The disavowal on the part of Western society to engage in direct confrontation is what frustrates the fundamentalist and perpetuates a politics charged with the triad of violence. Okay, so how can we use Zizek's triumvirate of violence to decipher his thoughts on the question of the State of Israel? I was reluctant to include this example, but I believe that Zizek discusses it so often because of how much distance the Western world tries to put between itself and the problem, and such an ability to disengage from actionable discourse is a liberalist privilege. And as we've shown with the symbolic violence, they come to terms with themselves through the language that has come from the Western world. Due to how recent the founding of the State of Israel is, there is a clear objection to systemic violence taking place before our eyes. Zizek says about his thoughts while he is visiting Israel, "In all honesty, I have to admit that every time I travel to Israel, I experience that strange thrill of entering a forbidden territory of illegitimate violence. Does this mean that I am not so secretly an anti-Semite? But what if what disturbs me is precisely that I find myself in a state which hasn't yet obliterated the founding violence of its illegitimate origins? It hasn't repressed them into a timeless past. In this sense, what the State of Israel confronts us with is merely the obliterated past of every state power." As Zizek acknowledges that systemic violence is not exclusive to the State of Israel and is therefore not necessarily anti-Semitic to single out, what complicates the matter is the intrusion of symbolic violence based on the instrumentalization by some Zionists of a dark stain of history, the Holocaust. Zizek claims that the only permitted reference to the Holocaust should be a negative one. The Holocaust should not be evoked to justify or legitimize any political measures, but only to delegitimize some other measures, to impose some limitations on our political acts. One is justified in condemning acts which display a hubris whose extreme expression was the Holocaust. In 2008, Zizek condemned the fundamentalism of ethnic religious claims to sacred land and advocated for a sort of compromise between the Israelis and Palestinians, which would also elevate Jerusalem into an extra-political sacred site beyond the political control of any ethnic group, hence the name of the chapter, the Jerusalem chalk circle as like an extra political space that would be exempt from status and systemic violence to preserve the religiosity of the space. And Zizek hopes that this renunciation of the ethnically pure nation state would be a liberation for themselves, not simply a sacrifice to be made for the other. Recently, though, even the historical symbols of the Holocaust and the site of Jerusalem have been usurped by the overblown systemic violence of Israel as the state. As empowered Zionists no longer care to legitimize their political actions in the realm of language. At an address to the Oxford Union in November of 2024, Zizek exemplifies the growing shamelessness of our present-day situation with an example of a certain tone of consensus within political debates in Israel. What depressed me, he says, what depressed me is the general tone of, it's a shame that our guards were arrested for doing this. Hamas is less than human. We can do whatever we want to them. Zizek asserts that it's better hypocrisy than this type of openness. I believe that what concerns Zizek now, almost 2 decades after the publication of Violence, is the apparent disintegration of the line between systemic and symbolic violence, which, as we can see, is already an almost invisible, objective reality that barely has a line within itself to divide. The efficiency of universality as a concept made great strides for the purposes of liberalism and global capitalism at once, but now the moralist mask is slipping to reveal almost automatic and unquestionable systemic violence. This mention of shamelessness for Zizek is not a call to conservatism or a balking at free speech. Rather, it is an acknowledgement of one of the strengths of liberalism, the space to enunciate a claim without having to renounce a position apart from language. If a meaningful symbolic space is superseded by statist violence, then any claim on the part of the state of what counts as subjective violence or crime is completely incommunicable and therefore indefensible one way or another. Thank you.